This video covers Chapter 11, Practice of Real Estate. It also includes Equal Housing Opportunity. It covers 12 questions. So let's get started. All right, we'll go to the board first. These dates that you see here, you won't have to memorize a whole lot of dates, but you do need to be familiar with these. At least be able in your head kind of generalize some of the dates here. Let's start out with post-Civil War. The first is 1866, and I'm going to go through these things quickly. When immediately after the Civil War, it says, and we'll go right to A here in the material on page number 131. Federal Fair Housing Laws, Civil Rights Act of 1866 prohibits racial discrimination in the buying, renting, selling, holding, or conveying of real and personal property. So immediately after the Civil War, the Civil Rights Act said, bottom line, you cannot discriminate based on any housing needs for renting or owning property. The next is jump nearly 100 years, or rather, almost more than 100 years, to 1968, and I'm going to refer to throughout this chapter, I'm going to call this group the protected classes. It's easier to say the protected classes rather than, let's go to the material. Federal Fair Housing Act of 1968 provides that it is unlawful to discriminate on the basis of, and these are the protected classes, race, color, religion, or national origin when selling or leasing residential property. So when I refer to the protected classes, that includes this group. So 100 years later, what you see here is a more, everything became a little bit more defined. So you had all citizens, and then you began to start defining certain protected classes, and those were included in 1968. Go to B1. It's 1974, added gender. The next, go to 1989, and in your material it says an amendment, this is C, an amendment to the Federal Fair Housing Laws went into effect in March of 1989, adding these two groups, handicap, familial status, to the list of protected classes and giving the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development more enforcement and authority. So these are the dates that you need to be aware of, understand that what essentially what's happening here, and that you start from the macro all citizens down to what we have the protected classes. So these things are kind of evolving as we go along. Go to C1B. All properties must be made available under the same terms and conditions as available to all other persons unless a property meets the standards for exemption as housing for older persons. We're going to get into a little bit more of a discussion about housing for elderly or older persons here in a minute, but suffice it to say that if you have a certain number of elderly persons in a certain community, you can call that an elderly community, and there's some things that they allow in terms of showing property, or rather selling property or renting property in those particular areas. So we'll get into that in just a second. Go to C2. We're still on page 131. The new amendment defines disability and physical or mental impairment substantially limits one or more of a person's major life activities. Okay, go to 2B. Persons who have AIDS are protected under the handicap classification, as are persons in addiction recovery program. So those are also protected classes. C, persons renting a dwelling and are required to permit handicapped persons to make modifications of existing premises at their own expense. So let me back up and explain what this is. When you're renting property, you have to make certain modifications so the person that has a handicap, possibly a wheelchair, ramp, you have to make those modifications, but it has to be on their expense. Okay, so that's a allowable thing, but you have to, as a property owner, you have to allow them to do those, but it's kind of on their dime, so to speak. So go to 10, or I'm sorry, go to D. In a rental property situation, a landlord may condition the agreement to allow modifications upon the agreement to restore the interior of the premises to the pre-modifications condition. So in other words, when that particular renter moves out, there can be, or there will be possibly, in the agreement a modification that has to be agreed to restore it to its original condition. So that can be worked out between the landlord and the renter. F, a licensee may not disclose to a seller or landlord that a prospective buyer or tenant is a member of a protected class. It's not required to do that, so you don't have to disclose that information. G, alcoholics and drug addicts who have been diagnosed, treated, and are not currently addicted are protected under the federal fair housing laws. They are considered to have a disability. However, convicted drug dealers are not covered under any condition. So they have to have been recovered, moved on, and not have that problem. H, people diagnosed as mentally ill are also protected under the federal laws. All right, so these are all protected classes that we've been discussing. Go to 5 on the same page. The 1988 amendment also provides that certain properties may be restricted for occupancy by the elderly. That's what we had discussed a little earlier, and there's more of a there's a defined or closer defined definition here on 5A. The amendments provide an exemption from familial status protection for housing intended for or occupied solely by persons 62 years of age or older, or housing intended, and we're going to top of page 133, for or occupied by at least one person 55 years of age or older per unit. Go to B. Properties complying with the 55 or older exemption must have at least 80% of the units occupied by at least one individual who is 55 years of age. Best way to remember all this is that, one, there might be questions that say, is this acceptable practice to discriminate based on housing in an elderly community? Well, the answer is yes, and then you'll need to know some of these other numbers. Properties complying with the 55, so if you can remember the 55-80, that's how I remember it, 55 or older, 80%. That's the best way to remember the actual numbers when it discusses this, or if the exam discusses any of these types of questions. Go all the way down to number 9 on that same page. Other prohibited discriminatory acts include, and we're going to run through these, and these are all, honestly, these are almost self-explanatory. They're very obvious that these are practices you shouldn't engage in. Number 1, or rather A, refusing to sell, rent, or negotiate with any persons as a means of discrimination. Some of these are pretty obvious. B, changing terms for different individuals as a means of discrimination. So you can't change the terms for this person versus a protected class. C, making discriminatory advertising statements. D, representing that a property is unavailable as a means of discrimination. E, block busting. I'm going to spend some time on E, F, and G. Those will be 3 that will, in all likelihood, be one of those 12 questions that we're discussing. First one, block busting, E. Making a profit by inducing owners to sell because of prospective entry of minorities into the neighborhood. Go into a particular area, say some of these people are moving into your neighborhood, you better go ahead and sell because you know what happens, that the property values will decline based on this minority moving into the area. That is called block busting, and it's illegal. F, redlining. And we can go to the board here. Notice here it says block busting, that previous one we just discussed. They sometimes refer to it as panic selling. So don't let that throw you off. Panic selling, same thing as block busting. They call it block busting and panic selling, and those are interchangeable. Redlining is the next one. I just put out there, it says banks. What this is, and I'll go back to the material, discriminatory denial of loans or insurance to people in selected areas regardless of their qualifications. So banks can't, and I guess a good way to remember redlining is if this was a map up here, and this was a map of any municipality, and they said, okay, we are not going to loan anywhere here. And I'm not using a red marker, I used a blue marker, but they mark this area and say, we are not going to loan any money or insure anything in this area because of whatever reason. Okay? That is called redlining. So it's a way to discriminate particular areas from not loaning funds in those areas. Next one is G, steering. Leading prospective homeowners to a specific area or avoiding specific areas either to maintain or change the character of an area. So a member of protected class comes to me and says, hey, I want to live over there where my culture, maybe skin color, those kind of things, I'm more comfortable over there. Well, that is not going to be in your criteria to show people properties. That is not in your criteria. It's called steering. Or if someone came to you and you said, you know what, I think you, a member of the protected class, would really be better over in this area. It's called steering. Can't do that. Okay. Go to 10C. Here's an exemption. Here's a few exemptions. The primary one that you should look for on your exam is C. Dwelling units owned by religious organizations may be restricted to persons of the same religion if membership is not restricted on the base of the protected classes. So here's what it is. Let's say and I think in the back of your chapter there's some questions that deal with a Catholic church has a apartment complex or some kind of a complex that they utilize for the members of their church, during times of trouble and, financial stress, and they would like to give them priority before they let anyone else in. That's an acceptable thing. They can do that. Okay, D, equal housing poster. The 1974 amendment to the 68 federal fair housing laws require that the equal housing opportunity logo, it's a poster, be posted with the agent's license. There's some equal housing posters that they have developed, HUD has developed, that you're supposed to put in prominent areas. Look for that one to possibly be on your test also. Roman numeral 2, same page, 134. ADA, this is the American with Disabilities Act. A, in 1990, or this law in 1990 affects real estate licensees because it addresses the rights of individuals with disabilities in employment and public accommodations. Go to D. The ADA, Title III, states that individuals with disabilities have the right to full and equal access to businesses, public services. Thus, building owners and managers must make sure, or be sure, that obstacles restricting those rights are eliminated. When you build commercial properties or have existing commercial properties, there's such things as, even whether it's a tenant in a residential or a commercial property, there are certain standards that must be met so they can access the property. Things like grab bars and grab bars in restrooms. Areas that they can maneuver in and out of. Ramps, access ramps. Those are things that are part of the building codes that homeowners or business owners have to maintain so they can have access to the property. Let's go to E on 135. The ADA also provides comprehensive guidance for making public facilities accessible. H, types of alterations that might be made to the public facilities and services include. So these are some of the examples I addressed just a second ago. Number 1, attaching grab bars to restroom stalls. 2, providing automatic entry doors. 3, adjusting the height of a pay telephone to make it accessible to a person in a wheelchair. And 4, converting information on real estate listings to large print or audio format. The questions will state something like these are characteristics of what law, and it'll give you A, B, C, and D, and you'll look for the ADA, making public facilities accessible. They might even ask you for examples. All of the above are except. So just be familiar with some of those things. And a lot of those things are pretty obvious about things that you have to make making facilities accessible. Those things are pretty obvious. Go to 3, Roman numeral 3, and that's called Truth in Lending Law. Reg Z. So let me point over here to the board. Reg Z is a rule or law that states in the most simplified terms that if you are going to extend credit with your product or service, then if you're going to have credit terms, then you need to have full disclosure. So credit terms and disclosure go hand in hand with Reg Z. And I'll read you the textbook definition here in just a second, but I'm trying to give you kind of a macro view. When you hear someone say on an advertisement or commercial, $500 a month, and then sometimes you hear these commercials that somebody comes on and you hear all this information that's kind of in a lower tone, and then the commercial goes on and it's APR, all this credit, all the credit terms. What that is they're abiding by Reg Z that says you can't just give a payment without giving APR, interest rate, and the term. You can't just give a piece of it. If you're going to give one part of it, you got to get all of it. All right? So Reg Z says if you're going to do any of it, you got to do all of it. That's the bottom line. So let's go to the text. Reg Z, disclosure, actually A1, disclosure requirements. A, require disclosure of all cost in credit transactions. So if you're extending credit, that's all cost. B, customer has the right to rescind in some types of credit transactions under certain conditions. For example, a second mortgage. You will close on some of these second mortgages and they'll say, okay, you'll get your check in a few days. And the consumer says, wait a minute, I need my check right now. I thought I got my check right now. Well, the reason they do that is because it gives you some time to rescind in some cases. And it differs with different situations, but that's part of that rescission process. If you decide to change your mind, then you haven't even received the check yet. You can go ahead and do that. 2, coverage of Reg Z. A, loans to individuals are covered for all real estate credit transactions, personal, family, and household purposes, regardless of the amount involved. So, when you're dealing in mortgages, then they will be covered by Reg Z, which is what our industry thrives on, are the mortgage-backed residential and commercial properties. B, loans to individuals are covered for non-real estate credit transactions for personal, family, and household purposes up to $25,000. So that is non-real estate credit transactions. They're covered for up to $25,000. What's not covered is if it's over that $25,000. Now, I'm not talking about residential real estate, commercial. When you're going in and you're buying houses, everything's covered regardless of the amount. But the agreements that are not covered are A, personal property credit transactions for amounts over $25,000. And then you should know C, business or commercial loans. So the questions will give you the characteristics of Reg Z, what's included, what's not included, so you need to know that $25,000 amount. And then business or commercial loans are not part of it. Okay, so those are the 2 things that you need to know about that. Next page, 136, 4A. All finance charges as well as the true annual interest rate must be disclosed to the customer before the transaction is completed. What is that interest rate? It's 4C. The finance charge must be stated as the APR. That's the annual percentage rate. 6, advertising. A Reg Z does not require brokers to advertise credit terms. If lenders advertise some credit details, however, they must fully disclose the terms. All right. C, go to 6C. Full disclosure of terms. These are all the things. If you give one piece of it, you got to give all of it. So know these for the exam. Full disclosure of terms is 1, the amount of down payment. 2, amount of loan or cash price. The finance charges on 3 or APR. 4, number, amount, and due dates of payments. And 5, total of all payments except where advertisement relates to a first mortgage. So you need to know all of those things in order to comply. So you can't just give pieces of it. 7, Reg Z is administered by the FTC. So know that Reg Z, its governing body is the FTC, or the Federal Trade Commission. And that concludes Chapter 11.